The snow in Tehran looked like ash. On the embassy roof in late November 1943, floodlights combed the sky and the city hummed with rumors. Inside, three men argued their way toward the shape of a future. Roosevelt warmed his hands over a teacup and spoke of broad principles. Churchill, with a cigar like a burning baton, spoke of fleets and beaches and timetables. Stalin, with the patience of granite, spoke of dates. Spring, Churchill said, tapping the table map where France turned from parchment to blood. May, if weather and the Almighty permit, we will prepare a lodgment on the Norman coast and bring in armies as if pouring steel through a funnel. Stalin's eyes did not move from the date he had written in his notebook. You mean, he said, a second front? A decisive one, Roosevelt added. Operation Overlord. Stalin turned a page. Then let us not worship code names. Let us worship punctuality. The Red Army bleeds. We will break the German back in our sector when you break his ribs in yours. You say May? Make it May, and I will launch bag ration in the summer and send them running from Minsk to the Niemen. Churchill's smile never quite reached his eyes. The sea, Marshall, is a creature with moods. So am I, Stalin said. It was the only joke he allowed that week, and even then, nobody laughed. By June 5, 1944, London breathed in time with a barometer falling over the channel. Weather ships sent thin hopes through fat static. Eisenhower counted hours like bullets. Churchill, awake in a dressing gown at number 10, listened to the rain worry the windows and thought of Gallipoli uninvited, like a ghost who knows the house too well. At 9 p.m., the word he had begged from the skies finally came. Go. The order began to move through cables like heat. Porters stirred. Coxswains cursed. Chaplains murmured. Pilots checked the ammeter with hands that shook only a little. A continent away in Moscow, it was already June 6th, gray dawn pressing at the Kremlin walls. In the map room under Whitehall, Churchill dictated a message that had the odd dignity of a man sending a prayer to a rival. Premier Stalin, he said, pacing, I write to inform you that the great enterprise has begun. Our troops are landing on the French coast this morning. The assault is proceeding in defiance of the weather. I believe we shall prevail. The typist's keys bit the paper. The cipher clerk took the letter away and turned it into numbers and then into thunder that crossed the night. In the Kremlin, Vyacheslav Molotov had already woken Stalin with a knock that carried no fear. The general secretary slept like a soldier, fully dressed except for his boots, documents on a chair, a pencil under his pillow like a short, blunt weapon. He read the first short summary of Allied airborne drops, the coastal bombardment, the minesweepers' lantern parade, then the Fuller cable from London. Churchill, Stalin said, as if using a title. He crossed to the window and drew the heavy curtain aside. Moscow was quiet the way a bear is quiet when it hears a twig crack. What shall we reply? Molotov asked. Stalin took a pencil and stood over a blank page. For a long moment, he only breathed. You would not have known from his posture that whole fronts were linked to the length of his sentences. At last, he said finally, and the word were not a sneer but something flatter and heavier. Congratulate him. No, not him, Britain and America. Tell them the landing is of enormous importance and that the Red Army greets their action. He paused. Add that we will do our part. Molotov wrote, do we mention dates for our offensive, Iosif Vissarionovich? Stalin turned the pencil between thumb and forefinger, slow as a lathe. We will mention that we know our duty. They understand calendars. So do we. He looked up, a glint under the hooded eyes. And we will fight for the front page as well as the frontier. You mean propaganda? I mean memory, Stalin said. Right. The successes of the Allied forces will find a reliable response in our actions on the Soviet-German front. It is plain, and it is a promise. Send it now. The reply left the Kremlin like a shot that refused to echo. Within an hour, a second, warmer cable was drafted. Congratulations on opening the long-awaited second front. Confidence in joint victory. Stalin initialed both with a precise, almost delicate hand. Then he summoned Zhukov. The marshal arrived smelling of frost and cigarettes, boots ringing on the parquet. On the table between them lay two maps. Normandy, all beaches and code names. Belorussia, all arrows and teeth. They have finally jumped, Stalin said, tapping the channel. So we will, as agreed, cut the spine. He tapped the second map, where the German army group center squatted like a wolf over the rails. I want German generals to lie to one another on the telephone until the wires melt. Zhukov glanced at the Normandy chart. We should expect them to pull air and reserves to the west. For 2 weeks, perhaps 3, the Germans will be uncertain. Then they will be certain and furious. Precisely why we must be earlier than their certainty, Stalin said. Advance the timetables where you can. The moment their newspapers write of success in the West, I want our artillery to begin a paragraph of its own. Zhukov's pencil started to dance, supply dumps to be rushed, pontoon parks to be shifted at night, extra bridging columns to be hidden in birch groves, deception radios to chatter louder. We can move the guns, sire. The men will move with them. Stalin nodded. Send word to Rokossovsky. Open the fan when the moment comes. Make the enemy guess which blade will cut. And tell him I approve his proposal for the double envelopment. He will deserve his wreath if he can tie it. When Zhukov left, the room seemed briefly larger, like a stage after the lead exits. Stalin stood alone and reread Churchill's lines. The cigar smoke might as well have curled up from the paper. He allowed himself to imagine the beaches, boys stumbling through surf, barbed wire rising like the ribs of an iron animal, German gunners swearing, the sea full of floating, human-colored punctuation marks to this new sentence of the war. So, he said to the empty room, you kept your May for June. I will keep my June for June. He folded the cable and slid it into his jacket pocket as if it were metal. In London, the Kremlin's reply reached Churchill while he stared at a wall map being pricked with colored pins. The message bore none of Stalin's barbed asides, none of the sly accounting of debts that had soured so many previous telegrams. It was astonishingly generous. Read it aloud, Churchill said. The duty officer did, and the map room listened with the reverence of men hearing a verdict. Good, Churchill said, blowing smoke that shook only a little. Tell the Prime Minister of the Soviet Union that we are grateful for his words and for his promised blows. He walked to the window. The rain had eased. The sky was the color of command decision. He knew Stalin would not celebrate sentiment. He would celebrate only synchrony, the mathematics of pressure. So be it. Churchill raised his glass, ginger ale this hour, not brandy, to the east and said, to nobody in particular, well then, Joseph, keep time. The first hours on the beaches made a liar of every optimist and pessimist both. At Omaha, the sea and the Germans conspired to write horror on a scale only those present can bear to remember. At Sword and Juneau, in Utah, the script was no less bloody, only less hopeless. The system began to show. Engineers blowing paths with ad hoc courage. Destroyers clawing into the shallows to duel with pillboxes at pistol range. Signalmen knitting a web out of noise. In Moscow, Stavka's radio room received news in bursts. Stalin preferred short reports. A staff officer read them aloud. Airborne scattered but linked. Can held in part. Utah secure. Omaha heavy casualties progressing. Stalin's eyebrow twitched once at Omaha, then smoothed. They will learn the shore, he said. Everyone does or dies. He asked for the weather. He asked for tides. He asked for the names of the British beaches as if names mattered to artillery. When told, Gold, Juneau, Sword, he snorted. Pretty. We will give them iron names. Orsha, Vitebsk, Mogilev. The next morning, Stalin sent a second message, shorter than the first. Please accept my thank for informing me of the landing. I join you in the hope that our combined blows will in the near future bring the downfall of Hitlerite Germany. It looked like courtesy. It was also a promise with a pistol grip. A week later, Churchill's officials carried into his study a cable whose very tone was artillery. The Red Army, it said, has begun a general offensive on the central sector. The date was June 22nd, exactly 3 years after the German invasion of the Soviet Union. Trains that might have gone west now sprouted eastward orders like thorns. What did Stalin say? a junior minister asked when we told him about D-Day. Churchill let the cigar ember grow bright and then dim. He said what a man says who has been asking for a thing for 2 years, he answered. He said, at last, "Congratulations. Now watch us." In the days after the landing, Allied press offices spun language like silk, but Stalin refused to play with thread. His private comments were blunt. He told a visiting envoy, "The landing is a great deed." He told Zhukov, "America fights with ships and factories. Britain fights with experience and stubbornness. Now they fight with blood." Good. He told himself, in a voice nobody heard, that history has an appetite, and today it was almost sated. Night after night, he took a walk in the garden behind the little corner, his private apartment in the Kremlin, a cigarette glimmering like a wandering star. He would stop at the pond, listen to frogs that seemed to have survived every purge, and weigh numbers. Divisions destroyed versus factories saved, lives spent versus lives spared by spending them now. His aides saw only smoke and the back of a coat. They did not see the older man inside the coat, counting like a bookkeeper at a ledger that had only 2 columns: victory and memory. On the 10th night after the landing, a courier brought him photos, gritty enlargements from reconnaissance. Beaches freckled with vehicles, the temporary harbors rising like industrial mushrooms, ships in ranks that looked like city streets had been rolled onto the sea. Stalin held one to the desk lamp and stared at the angles and shadows. "Churchill told me he would bring a city to France," he said at last. "He has brought an economy." He set the picture down and wrote his own sentence in the ledger. When he told me, I said, at last, "Congratulations. We will answer." Underline. New page. The Soviet offensive began like a door being kicked in by a very patient man. On June 22, 1944, 3 years to the day after Barbarossa, artillery along a front hundreds of miles wide opened its lungs. Forests shook their birds loose. The German maps that morning were already complicated. By afternoon, they were wrong. Rokossovsky's Central Front unfolded exactly as Stalin had ordered, opened the fan, with 2 blows diverging like prongs of an argument the enemy could not answer. Army Group Center, the spine Stalin had tapped with a pencil in the Kremlin, felt something snap. News of Bagration reached London through a thicket of signals, some sober, some exultant. Churchill read the summaries while chewing a cigar down to pulp. "Armies do not dissolve," he muttered, incredulous yet delighted. And yet, he drafted a cable that was part compliment, part calculation. "I congratulate you upon the mighty offensive which your armies have begun. The effect upon the enemy is already evident and will, I have no doubt, contribute decisively to the breaking of his power." In Moscow, Stalin received it with that small stillness that to his staff meant satisfaction. The reply he dictated was quick, almost casual, as if he were counting beats with a metronome only he could hear. "Thank you for your congratulations. Your landing in France is a most serious blow to the Germans. We are endeavoring to do our part." It sounded like politeness. It was tempo. If you listened at night in Moscow that summer, you could hear trains. They had always been there. The Soviet war ran on rails the way a heart runs on blood, but now the rhythm deepened. Trains carried forward entire pontoon parks, field bakeries, mobile tank repair shops, the bones and sinew of an army that had learned the expensive science of winning. Stalin visited Stavka each evening and asked the same unpoetic questions. How many bridges? How much fuel? How many feet of cable for the field telephones? Generals brought victory maps. Journalists brought metaphors. Stalin waved both aside for totals. He did, however, ask for one picture to be left on his desk. A reconnaissance shot of the Mulberry Harbor off Normandy, that man-made crescent of concrete and steel. He would glance at it, grunt, and go back to the day's ledger. He had told Churchill in Tehran that he respected punctuality. Now he respected manufacture. The Westerners had poured a city into the sea. The Red Army meant to pour Germany out of Europe. When Minsk fell in early July and the Soviet pincer snapped shut on tens of thousands of Germans, a colonel in the NKGB ventured a rare observation in Stalin's hearing. "Comrade Generalissimus, the German press will say the main blow is in the West. Stalin didn't look up. "Let them," he said. "They will be wrong in the morning and wrong again in the evening. We will be right all day." Churchill visited the battlefield in Normandy, mud painting the hems of his trousers, and returned to London with a farmer's appreciation for weather and soil. He also returned with a private letter to Stalin. No bluff, no embroidery. "The fighting is hard and progress is costly, but we advance. The enemy shows great tenacity. I feel sure, however, that with your hammer blows in the east and our lodgment firming in the west, his ruin is inevitable." Stalin's answer was not purple. He wrote that the Red Army had taken Minsk and is advancing on Vilna, Branovichi, Lublin, and that he fully agreed the enemy's ruin was inevitable. It was the diction of a ledger, columns closing, sums proving. He added a sentence that Churchill underlined: "Our armies will not relax their efforts." The grammar was modest, the meaning was iron. What did Stalin actually say when Churchill told him about D-Day? He said it in 3 acts, and every act had the same theme. Act I, night of June 6th, at last. Congratulations. We will do our part. No sarcasm in the record that day, no riddle wrapped in thorns, just relief edged with steel. The man who had demanded a second front since 1941 recognized a hinge when he heard a creak. Act II. A week later, as reports hardened, the landing is of enormous importance. The successes of the Allied forces will find a reliable response in our actions. The line was sent by cipher and by artillery barrage on June 22nd. Act III. As Bagration rolled, we will not relax our efforts, which in Stalin's vocabulary meant more than persistence. It meant logistics synchronized with weather. It meant burning through rails at a tempo the Wehrmacht could not match. It meant that while the West built a harbor on the ocean, the East built a tide on land. Between these acts, he said many other things, some poisonous, some generous, most practical. In private, he allowed himself a thin smile when he read that Allied troops had called the artificial harbor a Port Winston. "Good," he said. "Let them give names to ports and bridges. We will give names to prisoners." In late July, Churchill and Stalin traded messages about Poland, about the future frontiers, about who would feed whom winter coal. History would later wrap those exchanges in arguments, but in the summer of 1944, each line still smelled of gun oil. The point, for both, was simple: keep killing Germans until there aren't enough left to matter. Churchill, for his part, also said something by deed. He ordered RAF Bomber Command and the Yuzov to wreck the rails behind the German front with a thoroughness that would have impressed any Soviet quartermaster. When Stalin saw the reports, bridge after bridge cut, junctions cratered, he told Zhukov, "We will arrive before the telegraph does." And for a while they did. By August, as Allied armor broke out of Normandy and drove for Paris, Stalin received one more jubilant note from Churchill. "The capital of France is rising," it read, "and our troops are closing in." Stalin answered within hours: "Accept my congratulations on the successes of your armies and the liberation of Paris. The Red Army greets the valor of the French patriots." Courteous, yes, and calculated. He did not want to free Paris without a visible Soviet cheer in the transcript. That night he told his inner circle something blunter: "The Germans are losing their roads." When an army loses its roads, it has already left the battlefield. It simply doesn't know it yet. Autumn turned. Armies stumbled and surged. The Western Allies hit the wall of the Siegfried Line and tried to jump the Rhine on a carpet of parachutes at Arnhem. In Moscow, Stalin marked the setbacks on his map with the same small crosses he used for victories. "The British are brave," he said to Molotov, watching the Arnhem Bridge fail to change color. Bravery is an expensive way to learn geography. Still, when Churchill wrote, half rueful, wholly defiant, Stalin did not gloat. He sent another of his granite notes: "I have read of your operations with attention. We also encounter difficulties when success comes quickly. The enemy resists with desperation. He must be pressed." The sentence was both counsel and creed. Press they did. In the east, the Soviet hammer fell on the Vistula, on the Baltic, on the gates of Budapest. In the west, The Americans and British clawed through the Hurtgen, crossed the Maas, refueled in mud. The enemy made one last lunge in the Ardennes. The Red Army answered on the Vistula, Oder with a surge that felt less like a plan than a verdict. When Churchill informed Stalin in January 1945 that the Germans had struck in Belgium, asking if the Soviets might consider acceleration, Stalin's reply came with unusual warmth. We will undertake a new offensive in the near future. As ever, the near future turned out to be now. The Soviet winter blow began 10 days later, and the German High Command discovered that when you have two fronts, your reserves are always in the wrong place. Years later, memoirs would embroider motives, polish phrases, invent telephone jokes. But the skeletal truth remained plain enough in the cables. When Churchill told Stalin about D-Day, Stalin said three things that mattered and lived by them. At last, because the Second Front had been a drumbeat in his head since 1941. Congratulations. Because even he could admire audacity executed with factories. Now watch us. Because he intended to answer in the only language history respects, movement. And watch they did. The world watched a city set on the sea and an army set loose on a continent. One poured liberty down gangways. The other shoveled defeat back up rail lines. Between them, they collapsed an empire that had mistaken speed for destiny. On a winter evening after victory, Churchill would write that in June 1944 he'd felt the tides of fortune turning. Stalin, in a rarer lyrical mood recorded by an aide, said simply, "On the 6th of June they came ashore. On the 22nd we came forward." That is how you win a war. If you demand a single sentence, what did Stalin say when Churchill told him about D-Day? Strip away the smoke and translations, and it is this. At last, congratulations. We will do our part now. Everything else, the artillery pages, the trains, the cities rising from pontoons, was footnote and fulfillment.